Introduction, 5 paragraphs. There is a silent belief that governs the lives of millions of people. The idea that money resolves fear, that stability cures anxiety, that financial security brings inner peace. This belief is rarely questioned because it seems too obvious to doubt. But perhaps that is precisely where the problem lies. Perhaps what keeps us tired, repetitive, and trapped is not the lack of money, but the way we were taught to relate to it. We live in a culture that glorifies effort, sacrifice, and endurance, yet rarely speaks about consciousness. We work hard, but we rarely reflect on why. We earn money, but we don't understand what it is trying to compensate for. We become functional adults, yet remain internally immature. And then we call this normal life. But what if this normality is merely a collective agreement not to look any deeper? Rich Dad, Poor Dad is often presented as a book about finances. But when read attentively, it reveals something far more unsettling: a psychological portrait of modern obedience. A mirror that exposes how fear, desire, and the need for approval shape our choices long before any rational calculation takes place. In this context, money is not the central theme, it is the symptom. Perhaps you have never stopped to consider whether your pursuit of security is, in truth, an escape from the risk of living authentically. Perhaps you were taught to avoid mistakes, to follow safe paths, to repeat formulas that worked for others. But there is an invisible cost to this: the weakening of inner autonomy. And without autonomy there is no freedom, only adaptation. This video is not an invitation to get rich quickly, nor to reject the real world. It is an invitation to something rarer, to mature. To use money as a mirror, not as anesthesia. To look honestly at your relationship with work, time, and choice, with enough sincerity to transform. If you feel like you are functioning but not truly living, you may be in the right place. The myth of security, when money becomes a substitute for meaning. I want to begin this chapter by touching something delicate, almost invisible, yet deeply present in nearly all of our lives: the idea of security. Not real, living security rooted in awareness, but the psychological security we are taught to seek from a very early age. The kind that shows up as a steady paycheck, stability, predictability, benefits, social recognition. When examined more closely, this security is not merely economic. It is existential. It is a quiet attempt to numb the fear of living. In Rich Dad, Poor Dad, even before any financial concept is made explicit, there is a powerful symbolic tension. Two models of reality competing for the soul of a child. And this conflict is not really about money itself, but about what money represents internally. For one father, money is protection. For the other, it is a consequence. This difference, though it may seem simple, hides a profound psychological abyss. Because when money becomes protection, it takes on a weight that does not belong to it: the burden of providing meaning, identity, and value to life. You may recognize this within yourself. That sense of relief when the paycheck arrives. That quiet anxiety when instability appears on the horizon. That unspoken question: if I lose this, who am I? Here, money stops being a means and becomes an emotional pillar. And every external emotional pillar is fragile by nature. It demands constant maintenance, obedience, fear of mistakes, and often the renunciation of one's own truth. What Kiyosaki touches, though not in this language, is something depth psychology knows well. Human beings trade freedom for predictability when they cannot tolerate the emptiness of uncertainty. The problem is not seeking material security. The problem is turning it into a substitute for meaning. When that happens, life becomes a defensive equation. Choices are made not from inner alignment, but from fear of losing ground. Gradually, almost without noticing, one stops living and starts merely protecting oneself. Look at how this shows up in everyday life. Intelligent, sensitive, creative people trapped in jobs that drain their vital energy, maintained in the name of responsibility. Dreams indefinitely postponed. Intuition silenced. A tired body. A soul on hold. All of this upheld by a socially accepted narrative: that's just how it is. But repeated often enough, that phrase is not maturity, it is existential resignation. There is a crucial point here. Security sold as virtue often arises from unprocessed fear. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of deviating from the script. Fear of discovering that perhaps you have never truly lived. And so money becomes a symbolic shield against these questions. The more financially secure I feel, the less I have to face the inner void that frightens me. This is a silent bargain many people make, and they pay for it with their own vitality. In the symbolic language of the book, the poor dad is not poor only in money. He is poor in inner flexibility. Rich in degrees, rich in effort, rich in work ethic. but impoverished in his relationship with risk, failure, and inner autonomy. The rich dad, by contrast, does not reject security, but he does not idolize it. For him, security is not a fixed place, but an internal capacity to adapt, read reality, and take responsibility for one's choices. When I reflect on this, I can't avoid a question that may now be crossing your mind as well. How many decisions in your life were made to avoid fear rather than to honor your inner truth? This question does not ask for guilt. It asks for clarity. Because only when we see the mechanism can we begin to dismantle it gently. And dismantling the myth of security does not mean living irresponsibly, it means stopping the use of stability as existential anesthesia. There is something deeply liberating, and at the same time unsettling, about realizing that no external structure can guarantee inner peace. Not money, not career, not status. They may offer comfort, yes, but peace is born of coherence. And coherence emerges when what you do in the external world does not contradict what you quietly know, deep inside yourself. Where there is contradiction, no salary can cure the fatigue of the soul. Perhaps that is why this book provokes such intense reactions. Not because it teaches about money, but because it threatens a core belief of modernity, the idea that if we are prudent enough, life will not hurt us. But life always hurts. Maturity lies not in avoiding this, but in developing inner strength to move through the unpredictable without losing oneself. And that is not learned by blindly obeying inherited models. I do not want to conclude anything here. I only want to leave this unease alive. Because from this point on, something begins to shift. If the security you seek is not merely financial but existential, then perhaps money was never the problem. Perhaps it was the way you learned to protect yourself from the world. And that is exactly what we will begin to examine more closely in the next topic, when two fathers cease to be characters and become symbols of two forms of consciousness. Two fathers, two states of consciousness, the invisible formation of the financial mind. When we speak of a father, we are rarely speaking only of a person. We are speaking of a voice that installs itself within us long before we have the language to question it. A voice that shapes choices, fears, expectations, and the way we interpret the world. In Rich Dad Poor Dad, this insight appears almost symbolically, two fathers not as biographical figures, but as two fields of consciousness in constant dispute within the human mind. I like to think that these two fathers remain alive within us long after childhood. One teaches us to obey, to seek approval, to avoid mistakes, to do what is expected. The other provokes us to think, to question, to experiment, to take responsibility for our own path. Neither speaks only about money. They speak about how we position ourselves in life. Money is merely the stage on which this conflict becomes visible. From an early age, we learn that existing means fulfilling expectations. Study, work, stabilize, retire. This sequence is presented as natural, almost inevitable. The poor dad, in this sense, represents a consciousness shaped by survival within rigid systems. He is not a villain. He is the product of a world where mistakes are too costly. His primary virtue is caution. His primary flaw is rigidity. And rigidity, when it becomes identity, suffocates creativity and autonomy. The rich dad, by contrast, symbolizes a mind that does not fully outsource its destiny. He does not promise emotional safety. On the contrary, he demands discomfort, difficult questions, and exposure to error. This consciousness does not protect you from failure, it teaches you how to metabolize it. And that changes everything. Because those who learn to deal with failure stop living paralyzed by the fear of trying. Here, education is not merely intellectual, it is psychological and spiritual. Notice how these two voices show up in daily life. When an opportunity involving risk appears, which one speaks louder within you? The one that says, "This is dangerous, stay where you are," or the one that asks, "What can I learn from this even if it doesn't work out?" This internal dialogue happens constantly, almost always unconsciously. And the more unconscious it is, the more our choices feel automatic, as if there were no alternative. At this deeper level, the financial mind is not about numbers. It is about inner permissions. Permission to fail. Permission to grow outside the script. Permission to disappoint external expectations in order to remain faithful to something more intimate. The poor dad teaches us to seek ready-made answers. The rich dad teaches us to hold questions. And holding questions is one of the rarest and most mature human capacities. There is also a subtle spiritual dimension here. The father who teaches us to think fosters a less dependent relationship with external authority. He does not replace one belief with another, he stimulates a process. And processes require presence, patience, and responsibility. When this does not occur, A person may accumulate knowledge yet remain internally infantilized, always waiting for someone to tell them what to do. You may recognize this in moments of your own life. Situations in which, deep down, you knew you needed to take a risk but retreated out of fear of making a mistake. Situations in which you chose the right path, yet felt a quiet loss of vitality. These moments are not moral failures. They are signs of an unintegrated inner conflict, two fathers fighting for control of your life. Maturity does not require killing one of them. It requires integration. Caution has its place. The problem arises when it becomes sovereign. When every decision passes first through fear, life narrows. The consciousness of the rich dad does not eliminate fear. It moves through it. It recognizes risk but does not allow it to be the sole criterion for decision-making. This is psychological maturity. Notice how this manifests in the way we relate to money, work, and time. The father who dominates our mind determines whether we see work as a prison or as a field of learning, whether money is an end or a consequence, whether error is shame or a teacher. None of this is neutral. All of it is deeply tied to how we were taught to think, and, more importantly, to how we were never taught to feel these choices. I want to leave you with this living observation. Inside you, right now, two fathers are still speaking. One demands obedience. The other calls for awareness. One seeks external security. The other builds internal autonomy. And perhaps the point of transformation is not choosing one against the other, but noticing who has been guiding your decisions without your awareness. Because only from that awareness does real change begin. Work, identity, and self-deception. When making a living becomes losing yourself. There is a quiet moment in adult life when work stops being merely an activity and slowly becomes identity. It does not happen abruptly. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. First comes the social question, what do you do? Then the automatic answer. And before you realize it, what you do begins to define who you are. In Rich Dad, Poor Dad, this fusion of work and identity appears as one of the deepest traps. Not financial, but existential. I observe how many people confuse dignity with exhaustion. Working hard becomes proof of worth. Being constantly busy becomes a sign of importance. Rest, on the other hand, starts to carry guilt. This pattern does not arise by chance. It is inherited. It is taught. The Poor Dad, as a symbolic consciousness, teaches that work is a virtue in itself, regardless of its effect on the soul. The Rich Dad asks an uncomfortable question. Is this work building you or merely consuming your vital time? Here self-deception emerges. Because it is far easier to say, I have no choice, than to admit we are afraid to choose differently. The language of necessity often hides risk avoidance. This is not moral weakness, it is psychological conditioning. When we grow up learning that security comes from obedience, freedom begins to feel irresponsible. And so, making a living gradually turns into losing oneself, without drama, without collapse, simply through a slow hollowing out. Look at daily life. People who wait all week for the weekend to feel alive. Who count the years until retirement as if waiting for permission to exist. This reveals something profound. Time, which should be experience, becomes survival. Work, which could be expression, becomes endurance. Money, which could be a tool, becomes justification. None of this is pathological in isolation. The problem arises when it becomes permanent. The book indirectly points to a question we rarely ask. Why do I do what I do? Not to judge the answer, but to reveal the level of consciousness involved. When the answer is merely because it's safe, something is being sacrificed. When it is only because it pays the bills, something is being postponed. The Rich Dad does not reject these answers but insists on deepening them. He knows that a life sustained solely by obligation accrues high emotional interest. There is also a subtle psychological aspect. When work defines identity, any threat to it becomes a threat to the self. This is why change provokes panic, criticism hurts more than it should, and instability paralyzes. Not because work is too important, but because it has come to support something that should come from within. A sense of worth, belonging, meaning. This outsourcing of identity is one of the greatest sources of silent suffering in adult life. I have seen people remain for decades in roles that made them ill, justifying themselves with phrases that sounded mature on the surface but were defensive underneath. It's what there is. I can't take risks right now. I'll look at this later. Time passes. The body feels it. The soul contracts. And still the wheel keeps turning. The system works. The individual adapts. But adaptation without awareness becomes submission. The Rich Dad introduces a rupture here. He does not ask, how much do you earn, but what are you learning? This shift in axis is revolutionary. It moves the focus from immediate results to inner growth. Jobs stop being judged solely by salary and begin to be evaluated by their impact on the expansion of awareness, autonomy, and practical intelligence. This does not remove difficulties, but it transforms our relationship with them. When work is seen as a learning field, fear diminishes. It does not disappear, but it loses absolute control. Errors stop being threats to identity and become information. Changes stop being betrayals of the past and become adjustments to the present. This posture is not romantic, it is profoundly realistic. Because it recognizes that the only true stability lies in the capacity to learn and reinvent oneself. I do not want to close this chapter with answers. I want to leave a question pulsing, almost uncomfortable. If your work ceased to exist tomorrow, what in you would remain intact? This is not a practical question, it is an existential one. And it leads us towards something even deeper, the fear that sustains our choices. That is where we are heading next, as we enter the psychology of fear, desire, and silent obedience that keeps the so-called rat race in motion. Fear, desire, and obedience. The hidden psychology behind the rat race. There is a psychological mechanism so socially accepted that we rarely perceive it as imprisonment. It operates simply: fear of losing, desire to have, obedience to stay in the game. In Rich Dad Poor Dad, this mechanism is given an almost innocent name, the rat race, but beneath it lies a deep, silent, and extremely effective emotional machinery that keeps people busy, exhausted, and largely unconscious. I often notice that most financial decisions are born not of intelligence, but of anxiety. We work more because we are afraid. We spend more because we crave relief. We accept conditions that diminish us because obedience feels less painful than facing uncertainty. The system does not need to imprison us by force. It simply exploits unexamined emotions. And unexamined emotions govern life from the shadows. Fear here is not only the fear of lacking money. It is the fear of not belonging, of being seen as irresponsible, of disappointing family and social expectations. This fear disguises itself as prudence, maturity, common sense. But when observed honestly, it rarely asks what is true, only what is acceptable. And living solely to be acceptable exacts an unbearable long-term cost. Desire enters as compensation. Since life has become repetitive, exhausting, and devoid of meaning, consumption offers small spikes of pleasure. Not because we need things, but because we need to feel something. Buying, financing, displaying, comparing. Desire itself is not the problem. The problem arises when it is used to anesthetize a void we are afraid to face. Then it becomes compulsion, not choice. Between fear and desire, obedience emerges. Obedience to the clock, the boss, the social narrative, the inherited script. Obedience brings temporary relief because it removes the anguish of choice. Someone else decided for me. The path is already drawn. I just have to follow. But prolonged obedience weakens the inner muscles of autonomy. And without autonomy there is no freedom, only adaptation. The rat race is not about lack of intelligence. Many people trapped in it are highly capable. It is about lack of presence, lack of inner space to observe one's own emotional patterns. When fear and desire alternate control, life becomes reactive. One works to pay bills, pays bills to maintain a lifestyle, maintains the lifestyle to avoid shame. And the cycle closes. The rich dad, as a symbol of more awakened consciousness, points to something unsettling. As long as you react to fear and desire, you are not choosing, you are responding. Choice requires pause. It requires tolerating discomfort. It requires looking at emotions without immediately acting on them. This is deeply psychological and spiritual. It is the beginning of inner freedom, which always precedes any external freedom. When I observe this mechanism in action, I see that it does not break through force, but through clarity. The moment you realize you are working merely to sustain a fear, something shifts. The moment you recognize that you are desiring something only to fill a void, something softens. Awareness does not destroy the system. It prevents it from operating automatically within you. There is an important paradox here. Fear diminishes when faced but grows when obeyed. Desire becomes human when understood, but turns tyrannical when blindly followed. Obedience may protect in the short term, but it sickens in the long run. This triad, fear, desire, obedience, is not a personal flaw. It is a collective psychological structure. But the exit is always individual. I invite you to observe your own routine through this lens. Where do you work driven by fear? Where do you consume driven by desire? Where do you obey in order not to choose? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They demand sincerity over time. Because from that sincerity something rare is born. the possibility of leaving the race not by escaping but by awakening. And it is precisely this awakening that leads us to the next point, because if the prison is not external, neither is the key. It lies in what Kiyosaki calls financial intelligence, but at a deeper level, it is inner maturity. That is what we will begin to explore next. Financial intelligence as inner maturity, not accumulation. When people speak of financial intelligence, most imagine techniques, spreadsheets, numbers, strategies. But this is only the surface layer. In Rich Dad Poor Dad, what is truly at stake is something subtler: the ability to think, feel, and decide with autonomy in a territory where most people merely react. At this level, financial intelligence is not about how much you accumulate, but about how much you mature internally while dealing with resources, choices, and consequences. I noticed that many people accumulate money without developing awareness, and others develop awareness without ever learning how to deal with money. Both live fragmented lives. The Rich Dad proposes a rare integration, uniting practical thinking with inner responsibility. This requires something not taught in traditional education: the willingness to learn by doing, failing, adjusting, and reflecting. There is no maturity without friction with reality. There is a fundamental difference between accumulating and understanding. Accumulation can be compulsive. Understanding requires presence. Those who accumulate seek relief in the future. Those who understand build coherence in the present. Mature financial intelligence does not ask only, how much does this yield? But what does this require of me as a person? It demands clarity, patience, inner discipline, and the capacity to sustain long processes without immediate gratification. Here, money becomes a mirror. It reveals hidden emotional patterns. Impulsive people spend to feel control. Insecure people accumulate to feel protected. Anxious people chase shortcuts. None of this is morally wrong, but all of it reveals different levels of awareness. Maturity begins when we stop judging these patterns and start observing them honestly. The Rich Dad does not teach ready-made formulas. He teaches a way of thinking, a way that tolerates complexity, accepts that wrong decisions are part of learning, and understands that avoiding mistakes may cost more than making them consciously. This runs counter to traditional education, which rewards quick correctness and punishes failure. Here, failure is not defeat, it is the price of real learning. There is also a profound spiritual dimension here. Inner maturity means not projecting onto money what it cannot provide. Money does not heal existential emptiness. It does not resolve inner conflicts. It does not replace meaning. When we try to use it for that, it becomes a source of anxiety, never peace. Mature financial intelligence returns money to its proper place. A tool, not an emotional crutch. Notice how this maturity shows up in everyday life. Financially mature people are not necessarily those who earn the most, but those who betray themselves the least. They know how to say no. They know how to wait. They know how to lose without collapsing. They know how to win without getting lost. This requires a healthy relationship with time, desire, and identity, one that does not confuse personal worth with bank balance. I see many people chasing financial freedom as an escape. Escape from work, from bosses, from routine, from discomfort. But escape is not freedom. Freedom is the capacity to choose consciously, including staying when it makes sense. Inner maturity transforms the relationship with money because it first transforms the relationship with oneself. Without this, any external gain becomes just another sophisticated prison. At this point, the book invites us to a powerful inversion. Instead of asking, how much does this give me? Ask, who does this ask me to become? This question shifts the focus from outcome to process. And processes, when lived with presence, build something far more valuable than money: inner solidity. Without it, any success is unstable. With it, even losses teach. I want to leave you with this feeling. Perhaps true wealth lies not in having more, but in needing less to feel whole. Perhaps financial intelligence is, at its core, the art of not abandoning yourself while building something in the world. And that art leads us directly to the next central symbol of the book: assets and liabilities, not merely as financial categories, but as deep metaphors for what drains or nourishes your vital energy. Assets and liabilities as metaphors of the soul. What drains and what nourishes your vital energy. When we hear the words assets and liabilities, the mind usually jumps straight to numbers, property, investments. But in Rich Dad Poor Dad, these concepts conceal a much deeper dimension. They speak of flow, of what comes in and what flows out, of what sustains life and what slowly consumes it. In this sense, assets and liabilities are not merely financial categories, they are precise metaphors for the soul itself. I like to observe life as an energetic system. Some choices strengthen us over time. Others drain us even when they seem advantageous in the short term. An asset at this symbolic level is anything that returns energy, clarity, and autonomy. A liability is anything that demands constant maintenance, anxious attention, and internal justification just to keep existing. And the most dangerous liabilities are those disguised as achievements. How often do we celebrate something that secretly imprisons us? A position that consumes our nights. A lifestyle that requires silent sacrifices. A social image that must be upheld at any cost. All of this may be called assets externally, yet function as liabilities internally. Because they do not generate freedom, they generate dependence. And dependence always accrues emotional interest. The rich dad teaches us to look beyond appearances. He does not ask only whether something generates income, but whether it generates inner space. Space to think, to feel, to choose. This is deeply psychological. Many people are financially stable yet emotionally exhausted. They earn money but lose presence. And presence is the true asset of conscious life. Notice how this shows up in everyday experience. There are activities that, though tiring, leave a sense of expansion. Others, seemingly comfortable, leave a residue of emptiness. The difference lies not in effort but in alignment. When we do something that contradicts our deepest values, it becomes a psychic liability. It may not appear on a bank statement, but it shows up in the body, the mood, the quality of sleep. There is also a spiritual dimension here. What drains us distances us from ourselves. What nourishes us brings us closer to who we are. Modern life has trained us to ignore these subtle signals in the name of efficiency. But the cost of that ignorance is high. The longer we sustain internal liabilities, the less energy we have to create something new. And so we become stuck, not for lack of external options but from internal exhaustion. The book invites us, indirectly, to conduct an honest inventory of our lives, not only financial but existential. What in your routine functions as an asset of the soul? What operates as a silent liability? Relationships, habits, commitments, consumption patterns, ways of thinking. All of this belongs on the balance sheet. And this balance does not close with math, it closes with truth. When we begin to read life this way, something changes. Decisions stop being driven solely by status or fear and begin to be filtered by vitality. Does this strengthen me or drain me? It seems like a simple question, but it requires courage. Because many answers force us to reconsider old choices, constructed identities, promises made to others and to ourselves. I see people maintaining internal liabilities for years because they fear the emptiness that appears when they let them go. But that emptiness is not absence, it is space. Space for something more aligned to emerge. The rich dad does not teach us to accumulate things but to create systems, external and internal, that work in favor of life, not against it. Perhaps this is one of the most transformative insights of the book when read deeply. It teaches us to stop confusing movement with progress. Not everything that requires effort builds. Not everything that shines nourishes. And recognizing this is a decisive step toward inner freedom. A freedom that, in the next topic, will confront something even more delicate: error, risk, and shame, elements that immature consciousness avoids, but that maturity transforms into teachers. Error, risk, and shame, the learning that is born only outside social approval. There is a kind of learning that does not happen in classrooms, in books, or in protected environments. It is born through direct contact with error, risk, and the possibility of failing publicly. In Rich Dad Poor Dad, this dimension appears as a watershed between two forms of consciousness. One that seeks approval and one that seeks growth. And this difference is profoundly psychological, not technical. From an early age, we are trained to avoid mistakes. Error becomes synonymous with incompetence, failure, shame. The educational, family, and social systems reinforce this association constantly. The poor dad, as a symbolic figure, internalizes this logic. It is better not to try than to try and fail. Better to appear competent than to truly learn. This posture protects one's image but impoverishes experience. The rich dad introduces an almost scandalous rupture in this pattern. He does not romanticize error, but he normalizes it. For him, making mistakes is an inevitable part of any real learning process. More than that, those who avoid mistakes also avoid growth. This idea, when it penetrates consciousness, creates discomfort because it threatens an identity built on external approval. But it is precisely there that something new begins. There is a profound difference between making mistakes with presence and making mistakes through negligence. Transformative learning is born from the first. It requires responsibility, reflection, and humility. It requires looking at one's own error without emotional self-destruction. This is not simple. Shame appears. Fear of judgment appears. And it is at this point that many retreat, not because the risk is too great but because emotional exposure feels unbearable. I observe how shame governs silent choices. People stop trying something new not because they lack ability, but because they fear looking like beginners. Fear looking behind. Fear disappointing an image they have already built. And so they remain competent in areas that do not fulfill them, while suffocating potentials that never had the chance to mature. This is an invisible cost of social approval. Risk, in this context, is not merely financial. It is identitarian. To take a risk means admitting that you do not know, that you may fail, that you may need to start over. For an immature consciousness, this is unacceptable. For a mature consciousness, it is liberating. Because only those who accept not knowing can truly learn. The Rich Dad teaches this posture not through speeches, but through exposure to reality. There is also a deep spiritual aspect to this process. Error breaks the inflated ego. It returns us to the human condition. It reminds us that we are learners, not finished entities. Shame, when crossed with awareness, transforms into humility. And humility does not diminish, it expands. It opens space for new forms of intelligence to emerge. I have seen people completely change direction after a significant mistake. Not because the error was pleasant, but because it revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Others spent their entire lives avoiding any risk and, in the end, carry a silent regret, never having tried to be who they could have been. Between these two pains, the pain of error is temporary. The pain of the unlived is permanent. The book invites us, even if indirectly, to reframe error, not as something to be sought, but as something to be allowed. Allowed as part of the process. Allowed as a sign of movement. Allowed as the price of autonomy. Without this, any project of financial or personal freedom becomes illusory because it depends on the courage to cross unknown territories. I want you to observe where shame is still deciding for you, where fear of error keeps you small, where the search for approval prevents you from learning something new. These questions do not ask for immediate action, but for sustained awareness. Because it is from this awareness that the capacity for more lucid risk is born, not impulsive risk but aligned risk. And it is exactly this relationship with risk that leads us to the next topic. Because when error stops being an enemy, something changes in how we relate to time, waiting, and life itself. This is where we begin to talk about freedom, not as a future fantasy but as a present experience. Financial freedom and psychological time. Who controls your life when you don't notice? There is a quiet confusion that runs through almost every conversation about financial freedom. Many believe it begins when money is sufficient. But when we look more deeply, we realize that the true prison is not financial, it is temporal. It is the way our mind relates to time. In Rich Dad Poor Dad, freedom is not only about how much you earn, but about who controls the rhythm of your life. I like to think of time as the most neglected asset of human existence. It is spent before it is understood, sold before it is valued, and often sacrificed in the name of future promises that never arrive. The Poor Dad, as a symbolic consciousness, teaches the exchange of time for money almost automatically. The Rich Dad, on the other hand, asks an unsettling question. How long do you intend to do this without questioning it? Psychological time is not the clock. It is the internal sense of urgency, lateness, pressure. People trapped in the rat race are always running, even when they do not know exactly where they are going. They live according to deadlines, bills, and goals that never end. The future becomes a constant threat. The present, a functional interval. And so life is postponed in the name of a tomorrow that promises rest, but delivers only new demands. Financial freedom, at this deeper level, begins when the relationship with time changes. When the individual stops living only in reaction to external demands and begins to create internal spaces of choice. This does not require immediate wealth. It requires awareness. It requires noticing where time is being drained without existential return. It requires recognizing that being constantly busy is not a sign of importance. Often it is a sign of inner disorganization. Observe how this shows up in everyday life. People who cannot stop without feeling guilty, who fill every silence with tasks, who confuse rest with unproductivity. This reveals a mind colonized by external time, a mind that has lost contact with its internal rhythm. The Rich Dad does not glorify idleness, but he teaches respect for time as a space for strategy, reflection, and maturation. There is also a spiritual aspect here. When we lose control of our time, we lose the capacity for presence. And without presence, there is no consciousness. Life becomes a sequence of obligations fulfilled, not an experience lived. Money in this context becomes merely a survival marker. Freedom, on the other hand, begins when we recover the ability to say no without guilt and yes without fear. I see many people waiting for financial freedom in order to then live with more presence. But this is a subtle mistake. Presence does not come after freedom, it is the condition for freedom to be built. Those who cannot manage their internal time will hardly know how to deal with external abundance. They will remain prisoners of haste, fear, and comparison. The Rich Dad teaches implicitly how to think in terms of systems. Systems that work while you rest, systems that reduce dependence on the direct exchange of time for money. But before they are financial, these systems are mental. They are ways of thinking that respect time as an ally, not an enemy, that understand haste rarely builds anything solid. When we begin to observe our relationship with time, something uncomfortable becomes clear. A large part of our lives is lived on autopilot. Schedules, routines, commitments that were never consciously chosen, only inherited. Questioning this is not irresponsibility, it is maturity. Because only those who recognize where they are trapped can begin to free themselves. I want to leave you with this living question. Who controls your time today? Not in discourse but in practice. Where do you feel your life is being lived by demand rather than by choice? These questions do not ask for quick answers. They ask for honest observation over days and weeks. Because from this observation something fundamental is born. The possibility of reclaiming time as a space for life. And when this begins to happen, something even deeper is revealed. The way we learn, and the way we teach, starts to change. Because true freedom is not transmitted through rules but through example. That is what we will begin to explore in the next topic. Teaching without teaching. Consciousness, example, and inner responsibility. There is a kind of teaching that does not pass through words. It happens through presence, through posture toward life, through choices made when no one is watching. In Rich Dad Poor Dad, this may be one of the deepest and least explicit aspects of the work. Real learning does not happen because someone explains but because someone embodies. And this completely changes how we understand education, influence, and inner responsibility. The Rich Dad does not teach through long speeches or moralistic lessons. He creates situations. He provokes experiences. He exposes the learner to reality. And by doing so, he transmits something far more valuable than information. He transmits autonomy. The learner does not receive ready-made answers. He receives the task of thinking. And real thinking is always a solitary and transformative act. The Poor Dad, as a symbol, deeply believes in direct instruction, in the accumulation of formal knowledge, in the repetition of already legitimized truths. Not because this is useless but because it offers security. Teaching in this model is protecting. In the other model, teaching is challenging. One forms competent obedience. The other forms conscious individuals. Both have value but they produce very different human beings. I observe how many of us wait to be taught before living. We wait to feel safe before acting. We wait for approval before choosing. But life does not work that way. Maturity does not arrive as external permission. It is born when we take responsibility for learning from our own experiences. And this requires a profound shift in posture. Leaving the place of those who wait for instructions and entering the place of those who observe, test, fail, and adjust. There is something spiritually adult in this attitude. When we stop outsourcing the meaning of life to external authorities, whether parents, teachers, systems, or gurus, we begin to develop discernment. And discernment is not rebellion. It is the capacity to listen, evaluate, and decide for oneself. The Rich Dad does not create followers. He creates thinkers. And that is rare. This type of teaching also reveals something uncomfortable. We cannot demand from others what we do not practice. Many parents want their children to have a healthy relationship with money, time, and freedom, yet live trapped, anxious, and incoherent themselves. Children learn what they see, not what they hear. Example educates in silence. And silence, when incoherent, also teaches. Inner responsibility begins when we realize that the way we live is already a message to our children, our colleagues, and those who share life with us. Not as moral pressure, but as lucidity. It is not about being perfect, but about being honest. Honest about limits, fears, choices, and learning. This humanizes the process and opens space for more real learning. The book implicitly invites us to rethink the role of the mentor. A true mentor does not create dependence, he creates autonomy. He does not centralize knowledge, he stimulates observation. He does not offer easy shortcuts, he sustains the necessary discomfort for growth. This applies to parental, professional, and even spiritual relationships. I see many people accumulating courses, books, and methods, yet remaining internally immature, not due to lack of information but lack of conscious application. The rich dad teaches by living. And this confronts us with an inevitable question. What in your life is teaching even without you noticing? What kind of consciousness are your choices transmitting? This chapter does not ask for immediate change. It asks for progressive coherence, an alignment between what you know, what you feel, and what you do. Small, possible, real. Because it is from this coherence that inner authority is born. Not the authority that imposes, but the one that inspires. Not the one that dominates, but the one that invites. I do not want to end with conclusions. I only want to leave this perception alive. Perhaps the deepest transformation that Rich Dad Poor Dad proposes is not about money, work, or investments, but about how we assume responsibility for our own consciousness. And when that happens, life stops being mere survival and begins to become a crossing. The crossing of an ordinary man, when the relationship with money awakens consciousness. I want to tell you a simple story. Not about an extraordinary hero, nor about someone who defeated the system in a spectacular way. I want to talk about an ordinary man, so ordinary that he could be you or me or anyone who at some point felt they were living correctly but not fully. His name is Andre. The name does not matter much, but the place he was in does. Andre had a stable, respected job and a salary considered good. He paid his bills, helped his family, and was seen as responsible. From the outside, his life looked resolved. Inside, there was a fatigue difficult to explain. It was not only physical, it was the exhaustion of repeating days that left no mark on the soul. Andre used to tell himself that this was just how life was. That adulthood was like this. That freedom was a luxury for a few. He did not feel unhappy, and perhaps that was the problem. He felt anesthetized. Like someone living with the emotional volume always turned down to avoid discomfort. Money came in, money went out, and with it went the feeling of being alive. One day, almost by accident, Andre realized something simple and disturbing. He could not explain why he did what he did, he only knew how to keep doing it. His knowledge was functional, not conscious. He knew how to execute, comply, deliver. But he did not know who he was becoming by doing all of that. This question began to bother him more than any financial issue. There was no immediate rupture. No dramatic decision. What happened was a change in perspective. Andre began to observe his relationship with money as one observes a mirror. He noticed that he spent to compensate for exhaustion, that he saved out of fear rather than strategy, that he accepted uncomfortable situations to maintain an image of stability. None of this was new, it had simply never been seen honestly. He started small. He did not change jobs or quit everything. He began studying, but not as before. Not to accumulate information but to understand processes. He started asking less, how much does this yield? And more, what does this teach me? He began making mistakes in new areas. He felt shame. He felt fear. But for the first time in a long while, he felt present. There were difficult months. Months when Andre thought about going back, when old security felt seductive. But something had already changed. He had realized that the real prison was not the job, the salary, or the system. It was the way he had outsourced his choices for so long. And that realization could not be forgotten. Gradually, Andre began to reorganize his life as one reorganizes an inner space. He cut passives that drained his energy. He created small assets of autonomy. He learned to relate better to time. He learned to say no without over-justifying. He learned to wait without anxiety. Money stopped being the center, it became a consequence. What is most interesting is that, from the outside, his life did not look revolutionary. But inside, everything had changed. Andre no longer felt hostage. He did not have all the answers, but he had something more valuable. Enough clarity to keep asking. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled. Desire still appeared, but it no longer controlled. Obedience gave way to responsibility. This story does not end with extraordinary wealth. It ends with something rarer: integration. Andre began living with less haste and more intention, with less comparison and more presence. Money found its place. Work gained new meaning. Time stopped being an enemy. And above all, Andre stopped abandoning himself to fit into a model he had never consciously chosen. I tell this story because it is not about finances. It is about maturation. Rich Dad Poor Dad, when read deeply, does not teach how to get rich. It teaches how to stop being poor in consciousness, how to stop confusing security with meaning, how to transform the relationship with money into a path of self-knowledge and inner freedom. Perhaps you will not change everything tomorrow, and that is not the point. The point is to notice. To notice where you are reacting instead of choosing, obeying instead of understanding, accumulating instead of integrating. Real transformation does not happen in grand leaps, but in quiet adjustments sustained over time. If there is one thing this crossing teaches us, it is that freedom is not a future destination. It is a present posture, a way of relating to fear, desire, error, and time. When this posture is born, money ceases to be a central problem, and life finally begins to make sense from the inside out.